Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another SixyTimes Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are, of course, playing Dead or Alive. And as with all our 2MK content, this is more or less a US East Coast 2 lounge. You can find it just by doing basic search, and of course looking for 2MK as the lounge name. Who is playing and who is talking will be shifting as we move around today to get a little bit of practice from Just Vine's side before we get fully into it. So technically it is her that is playing our Hitomi main, which is a good start off given that her opponent is OmniRabbit, who tends to have a good grasp of these games in the way that is required to stand up to Just Fine. So I expect to see at least a couple interesting matches before anyone else joins in. This is a loser stays on lounge with a limit of 3 losses. So since you do have to basically check it that way now, we don't expect to see anyone who's going to be horribly upset about this setting. Note that the health bars are also set to large. As this is partially practice and we're not that great yet, it would be good to make a couple more mistakes without terribly losing. Need a little more adaptation time. Eventually we may change the lounge to be more serious in terms of health, but honestly, as it really only affects wins most of the time, and this is a loser stays on lounge, it is not really important mostly. Today we will be talking a little bit more about some of the mechanics in this game, specifically the ways that a beginner might learn to deal with them or think about them, which is generally our content. If you've watched our other things, you know how this goes. We talk about how exactly you can try to learn things rather than specifically how to do them. There are multiple places you can find top level players telling you how to do things correctly. We more so specialize in why you're probably neurologically doing it wrong, to help you get over whatever hump you have finding on your path to their advice. It's going to be a little bit harder to see now though, as these two players don't make the general type of mistake where it comes up a lot. Their timing may be off, but timing being off isn't really something you fix that way. You can't tell how it's going to work just because of that. You are likely to see a lot more movement and mindfulness in flow though, so keeping up with and watching them might be a little bit harder than when some of our less experienced players are throwing down. You're also likely to see a lot more holds, basically because they have a closer idea of why certain things happen in flows, and often this tends to lead to you making holds that would otherwise seem difficult. These are not predictions in the straight sense, they're technically reads. There's no way to look at what happened before and know what is happening next, or to be ready for what is happening next and do it in time. This is straight up, I feel as if you're going to do mid kick in this space, so I'm going to hold mid kick. As mentioned, the people actually speaking on this stream may change as we go. Right now, you get Rillian, and it may change to Kansuki Dynasty, aka Rune Siren or Helena, at some point during the stream, based on experiences being had and other things that need to be done. We expect this lounge to go probably for another hour and a half, likely to end around 8:45 Eastern. since when the lounge creator leaves DoA lounges, the lounge ends. It's less likely that it will stay open in the same state, regardless. So for now, enjoy the thought processes of two relatively inexperienced players in terms of DoA's combos and full play options, but who still have a fairly good idea of what they want to do, what they like to do, their fighting style, and are not currently trying to adapt to any new characters or anything confusing like that. They are definitely at least aiming for the level of play that they are currently capable of, the top of it, and not specifically, oh, I'm practicing this, oh, I'm learning this. That may come later on in the stream, but, you know, Just Fine's getting in a little practice because since she is not often the player in our streams, games that get a little less focus tend to not get touched by her for long periods at a time. And we all love to play fighting games because we like to be playing our mains, understanding, flowing through with our characters. So it gets a little sad sometimes to not be able to do that for a long time. Even in games you don't like all that much, or wouldn't spend a lot of time playing because the top level of it is not your thing, sometimes the mid-level or the lower level of a game is still fun enough that you don't really care. Fortunately, DoA is not one of those things. It is, to us, more fun version of Tekken, which is among the few fighting games that you will generally not see on our channel. No disrespect to the Tekken heads, just not our thing apparently. And DoA does a good job of filling that gap. So as we go, we will definitely be talking about some stuff we normally throw in at the beginning of the stream so that people who are watching for the first time don't know whether or not they'd like a game or not. You know, just random, basically. We'll be able to understand a little more of what's going on, especially if they aren't really 3D fighting game people. If you watch most of our other content, it's, well, basically the only one we play, so. We were gonna Soul Calibur for a bit, but then it just kind of died off in a different way. There will probably be a long explanation one day for why we don't currently play Soul Calibur. What we can say is that it's not really a matter of we don't have the time to play Soul Calibur, or necessarily we don't want to buy enough copies of Soul Calibur to play. It's just sort of Soul Calibur itself, but not in the same way. It is a little bit odd to have a DoA game where Wake Up Super has become part of the terminology. It's definitely been a good thing lately how fighting game designers have been exposed to enough different fighting games, different players, different ways of thought, that a lot of the archetypal character behaviors tend to get put into the corresponding characters with corresponding fighting styles. It does make it a little bit easy, basically, to go, oh, yeah, that character who fights like me also acts like me, at least somewhat. Or, if you're the type, opposite way around. Huh, this character acts like me, I bet you they have a fighting style similar to mine. Not always, but it happens often enough now that it's much easier to pick characters in the game if you have a strong particular concept of your own personality. But let's get into our usual startup concept DoA stuff. Point 1. If you are not used to 3D games, the default block position in these games is back, not down back. Because most characters don't get as much damage from their low attacks as they do from their mid attacks. Now, your mid attacks break, crouch, and guard, because effectively speaking, it's someone kicking you in the head, and even if you're low and grounded, you probably would still lose your balance. Technically, it is the 2D games that are slightly less realistic in this regard. Most martial artists will tell you that a crouching guard would not really be that effective most of the time, but you do need to do it in order to make sure that your opponent does not sweep your feet sometimes. That's one of the hardest things to get used to, but if you've got enough time to play around with one of our bots, or just check a certain thing in the CPU is a kind of a pain because as with most games, if you set it too low, it doesn't take enough actions, and if you set it too high, it basically reads your inputs. Which is why we really didn't bother training in this game until bots had been developed for it. We're just too used to the idea that the CPU, while helpful to make you understand a character, sometimes is not necessarily helpful to get you past your own mental blocks, which is mainly what bots are for. So yes, remember to block mid, block standing most of the time. Even if your opponent hits you with a low, many opponents have relatively slower lows, and their faster lows don't actually combo into much. There are a few characters where that is not true, and those characters tend to not have the greatest of mids, meaning that you generally should be able to go, okay, I'll make sure to do that. On this character specifically, I'll make sure to block this way more often. Another thing to understand about this game, which has been true in some games, less true in others, is that throws are faster than most normals. I think the majority of fighting games these days, other than Street Fighter, this is true. A lot of anime style games have 5-frame or 6-frame throws, and their fastest buttons are also this way. This is simply because once you're as close as possible to your opponent, throws are a good thing. But this game has throws with variable startup because it has so many throws. They're used for positioning, for understanding the opponent's flow, for messing with the opponent's flow when they decide to try to counter you and expect you to keep on attacking. But most importantly for a new player, they're used when your opponent has made you block, ended up really close to you, and you think they're done but don't know what to press. Why? Because this game has a priority system when it comes to those things. Strikes will generally beat throws, but if you think your opponent's done hitting buttons, then you're not worried about strikes, right? And if you're wrong, then you should have kept blocking. Throws beat holds, specifically if you decided, okay, I think my opponent is going to keep hitting me, so I'm going to predict their attack and do the correct hold, which is basically a parry. There are 4 ways to do it. Technically 5 if you count the break hold, but we don't. And if you thought it was going to happen, you decide, I'm going to hold the opponent. The opponent's best option is to throw you. That said, you can still tech the throw, and these players are probably the only ones in our group who will currently ever do that. To the point where I think for this match and previous matches, I think we've seen more throws teched than actually landing, or at least even. They both have a good sense of rhythm as to when the opponent will probably try to throw, and that brings us to the next point of this game. They also have proper throw timing, because that is required here. This is one of the few games where you cannot simply press the throw button at the same time or nearly the same time as the opponent, and everything be fine. It's not completely clear even after reading it multiple times from multiple places what is going on when you try to tech throws in DoA, but we do know that just pressing the throw button as soon as you think you're going to be thrown leads to you taking worse damage and the opponent definitely getting the throw off. It actually shows as a high counter throw. You have to wait a little bit until they have actually tried to grab you and then react to this by teching that throw. So bear in mind that you can't just go, my opponent's about to throw me, so I'm throwing now. One of the two of you is going to lose, and it's probably not them. And of course, this brings us to how to beat the strikes themselves, and we've already mentioned that. Just hold them. I mean, that sounds super easy, but we'll have like 3 bots dedicated to just understanding when and how to hold, because it's hard. Holds are basically up, back, plus hold in order to guard against high attacks, high kicks at your head. This might be hard to figure out what that is, but you'll get used to them. Most really fast jabs and punches are also aimed at the head and will be countered by this high hold. Low holds are for stopping lows, which, as you can guess, since it's not super important, people don't exactly go for lows that often unless they think it's going to get them positional advantage. Aim to go for your low holds when you think your opponent is trying to push you to a space on the screen that you don't want to be. Because that's probably the only time it's going to happen. Especially if you want to move out of the space, they'll probably try to use the low attack to check you and make sure that you do not, because if you decided to block suddenly, you probably were not going to be low blocking. It gives them just enough time to reposition and at least keep you where you are. So general tip for when to go for your low hold. Of course you can just predict whatever your opponent is doing, but there are less actual lows in most characters' combos, and your real difficulty is determining which mid to hold. Specifically in the 4-way hold system, you must hold mid punches using back and hold mid kicks using forward and hold, meaning that if you just mash, your opponent will simply change whether or not they're punching or kicking you, and then you will get hit anyway. And since it's a mid, it usually combos, so you've just left yourself open to big damage. Understanding which moves are mids can be relatively difficult. A better way to think about it is that they tend to be large sweeping moves, like that one for example. If they're not really obviously highs, assume they're mids. A lot of the time, when you're being hit by a move and you can't think of why and it's a kick, just do the mid kick hold, because there's a decent chance that just because it looks like a high does not mean it is, especially if it involves a large amount of body movement on the part of your opponent. This is one of the most important things to remember, and one of the things that our bots don't quite teach yet, because it's hard to get them to do that type of kick consistently enough without being completely devoted to it. So in general, yes, default to assuming that those things are mid kicks, until you find out something else. Meaning that when you're far from your opponent and you expect a kick to be coming, forward hold. There are of course those which are long range, what we like to call zoning kicks. They're very aimed at the opponent's head, they're usually quite fast, or usually not very stoppable anyway. And you can easily tell by whether or not you're able to crouch under them. In fact, for the most part, that's how you should remember that the other kicks are not mids. If you feel as if the motion would allow you to crouch entirely under the move hitting you, or you try it and you don't succeed at doing that, then it's not a high. In general, if it were a high, you would be able to crouch under it. That's the way the game works. So, those swinging over feet things, just assume they're mid kicks and forward hold them. Which leads you to points where people will actually try to figure out other ways to get you to mess those up, or rather your interactions with those. But it would help if you got that far first, right? Thankfully, DoA is not a super complicated game in terms of what to do. There is a lot of complexity in what you need to understand about what's happening, which we'll talk a little about, but if you just wanted to jump into the game, like if you wanted to join this lounge right now, you would probably be functional if you knew your character's moves and those three things. Don't block low unless you need to. When you don't know how to punish, just hit throw. Usually just stand throw. You might want to check the frame data on your character. You can easily check it. Most people though have like 6 or 8 frames. 6? They're decently fast. Just hit throw without any other directions. And if that's too slow or doesn't work, try forward or back and hope for the best. There are going to be different speeds. Which one is the fastest or slowest? You will probably have to learn from experience if you aren't familiar with how to read frame data. And of course, how to hold things and what to expect from your holds is about all you need. The special attack button, which does flashy combos, doesn't actually do that much damage, which is technically the next thing we'll be talking about. Most of the damage in this game is not done by just hitting people with combos. In fact, most of the damage in this game comes from understanding what your opponent is going to do and defeating that specifically, because counter damage in this game is quite high, and then there's even high counter damage, which in some cases goes all the way up to double the actual regular damage of the move. So, honestly, you're spending most of your time in this game thinking, my opponent is going to do this, I know what to do here, I'm going to counter this move. And if you counter it correctly, then yeah, they're in trouble. You even have high counter holds, which are, I believe that the explanation is that you did the hold before the opponent even started the move per se, or that you did it before their move became a certain amount of active, something like that. When you read DoA's terminology, it can be confusing at first, not because it's particularly unclear in itself, but because understanding what that means on a screen is different. There are a couple more complex things, OmniRapid just having demonstrated one. Offensive holds, high counter holds, high counter throws, things that serve more than one purpose. There are moves, for example, that because they are crouching and it lowers the character to a crouching stance, they go under high moves. There are other moves that, because they hop, they defeat low moves, and there are other moves which are kind of odd in that they specifically defeat moves that look similar in height. Honoka's hop that you saw a little bit earlier, and may see again, but probably not that soon, given the opponent, involves hopping onto the opponent's shoulders, but it also defeats most high moves, particularly high kicks, because the way she does it involves throwing her momentum up before you can do much. Elliot has similar things where he will go under opposing attacks, particularly their high kicks, to strike at their legs and then get combos from those, because he is what we consider to be a zoner in this style of game. Someone who is able to keep the opponent from using their max range attacks without just blocking or moving out of the way. That's closest to what most people will call a zoner in this type of game. Having very long range attacks helps, and he does have them, but having good ways of preventing those attacks from hitting you while attacking yourself also counts as strong type of space control zoning, which is the type that Space Wolf basically specializes in. OmniRabbit, of course, knows this and tends to play a little bit more cautiously, specifically moving to good positions, but not actually attacking. Which is usually a good way to deal with zoners. And of course that brings us to, how do you get out of things like pressure? Well, if you can hold the opponent, you can hold even while you're being hit. Although, we're not completely sure how this has changed. They say that now it's available in Critical Stun. Critical Stun being the situation you end up in when you have not... when you were hitting a button or got countered in some way, and the opponent functionally counter hit you and now you are staggered a little bit. This does seem to make holds more difficult. Not all of them. If your opponent decides to go for a slower move, sure, but the holds do have some form of startup apparently, and therefore you can be hit. Easiest way to remember this is if you were being hit and you saw a red flash at the side of the screen, I think it's on your opponent's side, it indicates that they have counter hit you, and your hold will be either more difficult or we're personally feeling is sort of impossible depending on what moves they choose. So keep blocking and hope for the best. If you were whiff punished, i.e. you weren't counter hit, your opponent hit you after, or just hit you in neutral because you were moving and you hadn't hit any buttons, it's much easier in most cases to hold the next move so you can focus on that there. They're also less likely to stop attacking, and you're more likely personally to not be surprised, meaning you're likely to hit or hold the second move in their chain instead of the third. And the third one is the one that usually has the most variation, so you're not as likely to get it wrong or get messed up if you are realizing that situation quickly. Certain moves don't give the opponent quite enough advantage though, and you'll have to learn that as you go. But if you read it, it's basically that critical stun doesn't necessarily mean counter anything. So critical stun, if it comes up on your side, does not mean that you can't hold. It's only when you see on your opponent's side of the screen, your opponent's character side of the screen, as in where their life bar is, you see any red flash, counter strike you see coming up there, you might not want to try to hold right then. All these terms can be intimidating if you don't understand why they need to be all different, but it's not that bad, really. It's just that reading it on a screen, reading it in like a manual or something, doesn't tell you anything about what's going to happen on the screen or why, so it can be rough. And as noted and shown just now, Elliot is a good example of a character who, because their moves are so good at holding you in place, they can get counter-strike, and probably you can still hold. Because Elliot's faster moves, while they will definitely get you, he's not always in position or particularly committed to doing those, and therefore might go for something slower to knock you away from him, which you could then hold. So just remember it as that red flash that I mentioned does not necessarily mean you absolutely can't hold. You definitely have to think about whether or not your opponent managed it with a quick move or a slower one. But beyond that, you're probably good to go. As you may be able to see, if you're watching health bars for example, depending on the move, counter strikes really increase your damage. Most punches, not so much. Those are sort of expected to happen occasionally, so I think there's a little less strength in those. And they are slightly to get the high counter strike that you're seeing. Occasionally from kicks or longer swinging punches and similar. But we've reached the end, probably, of Just Fine's matches, as his loser stays on, and she's now shifted out of things. So we're going to be moving on to having Kansuki Dynasty, aka Rune Siren, play Lena from here on. And, obviously, our lounge is full. So you'll be listening to me for a little bit longer and possibly swap back in later. But we may switch off who's on the mic at some point fairly soon. Most likely after the next. Or depending on whether or not she wins or loses between the next matches from this side. If you think that holds are most important in this game, honestly, no. Blocking is actually super important. Holds are something you have to learn to prevent certain things from happening to you, especially at the lower levels. But at mid to high levels, you are probably better off blocking because your opponent is used to being held and won't necessarily do anything. Or they'll go for a throw in a timing where you would otherwise have spent too much time doing something else, but still, overall, you don't necessarily care that much. Holds are more so a mindset, and you have to think about it over time to resolve it. Which is partially why the practice of the bots we have focuses on it so much because someone getting into the game and learning their combos is probably also going to spend at least a certain amount of time just more or less hitting buttons and practicing confirming things while fighting the bots anyway. Learning to interact with other moves, the bots doing moves, you could at any time shift from trying to hold those moves to trying some other interaction with those moves, and it would most likely be fine. As far as we are aware, there are no additional free characters this week. You can see it on the screen. Everyone having the white lock icon. I believe it is a yellow unlock icon. At those times where a character is available for that reason. And there's one good reminder. Throws on offensive holds tend to grab an opponent whether or not they're moving to the side. Tracking is basically a measure of how much a move is likely to hit someone who has tried to sidestep out of the way of it. Anyone attempting to sidestep gets counter hit or counter thrown whenever they do get hit or thrown, meaning that you're more likely to get more damage. And that's just the game reminding you that yes, when you do counters, especially high counters, your damage is greatly increased. That's why sometimes it looks like they're barely poking at each other, and sometimes it looks like nearly a quarter of someone's health has disappeared. Bayman is a character who gets to do a lot more pressure style things in a way that's not familiar entirely to those who haven't played 3D games. Bayman's pressure comes from the fact that nearly all of his short combos put you at a good spacing for another button he wants to hit, and he usually has more than one option at that range, meaning you can't just go, oh, he's put me here, let me high hold. Range really helps here in that specific way. It doesn't come up too often from many other things you do. Obviously, either you're in range or out of range, and that is an important aspect, but being able to keep your opponent at a range where you get to keep hitting buttons and they can't be sure what to hold can be helpful simply because you don't end up necessarily telegraphing anything. In other flows, the opponent can go, well, you moved, so I presume that either you're going to go for this kick now, it's longer telegraphed basically, or you're probably done with your attack, so they know either they're coming forward, or block a little while and then come forward. They have a better idea what's coming than with a character like Bayman, who basically just hits you and then stands there. However, this does mean that he doesn't often have tools for surprising the opponent too much, and relies a reasonable amount on defense for that reason. He doesn't have a lot of leaping lunges that are based around stopping an opponent who is approaching. He does have a few things, but even these are relatively easy to see and not too hard to hold. Contrasting with Ayane, who is, as a character design, almost entirely this type of move when she's not just beating you up with close range combos.
Don't make me laugh.
In fact, she specifically has moves that trick you into thinking she wants to do one thing, and of course she does another, because she's a ninja character. But now we see once again Rune Siren shifting back to fight, and looking from the look of this, almost certainly facing off against the Wolf. This match is a little bit hard on both sides, as neither player has a strong advantage per se. But it is true that they have different strengths once they get into particular positions, meaning they have different aims for the most part. The problem is that they have to play neutral for so long that it doesn't really come up as a strong thing. Bayman is not really trying to get in to grab Helena, nor is Helena trying to play footsies and dominate neutral against Bayman, because she cannot and basically he cannot. But once you have gotten an advantage, your opponent has to worry now, because you get to keep it going fairly well.
I cannot lose this fight.
Another ninja.
This is also the match that brings us closest to the last thing you generally need to understand as a beginner, but I needed to wait until the match where it really comes up in order to talk about it. Understanding how to recover from being hit, particularly from being thrown to the ground, is a big part of this game. It's a big part of 3D games in general. Should you recover backward, recover forward, which is technically in this case to get up standing where you are, or get up slightly sliding toward the left or right. The game gives you all of these options, along with a couple other things really. These are executed mostly by double tapping the button, but depending on the timing of the knockdown, you may not actually get that right, and you don't want to necessarily overdo it. So, one of the general ways that you remember, because if you press kicks, it will actually lead to wake up attacks. You can press down and kick for a wake up sweep style attack, and just standing kick for a longer range one. Instead, simply press your punch button when rising instead. Think of it as a way of activating your back roll or side roll or whatever. Hold the direction you want to go, and if necessary, press the punch button. Why did she turn gold?
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
I mean, I guess you could do that. But now this means I'm handing over the mic, as she has won the match, and therefore we'll have minor things to talk about in terms of DoA as a whole, relative to the things I said, maybe just general experience, at least for a while before I get back on.
Hello everyone, I have returned in my new gold form, apparently. But yes, the whole knowing how you want to recover from something does seem to be kind of important. There was one of the rounds that I had in that fight just now actually where I wasn't really correctly on point in terms of knowing what I wanted to do for recoveries or just after recoveries, and then obviously I ended up getting completely excuse me, completely snowballed as a result.
All right. I will do my best.
I challenge you.
But yes, it seems sort of as though, regardless of what your plan is, specifically having a clear idea of what you want to do in your recovery or after something big happens is more important almost than necessarily even being able to do it well. Because if you keep on point mentally enough to be able to have a thing you want to do, or figure one out in the moment, if that's your style, you're going to have at least the opportunity to take hold, whatever, control of the situation, rather than effectively letting your opponent, who is obviously, if they just did knock you down or something, in a confident position, more or less, dictate the flow of the next interaction, which can then become the next interaction, and the next interaction, and eventually run out. I'm going to have to find out whether it was winning the match or the break below that got me my gold, and if I can level up further. But here we go, finally. Alright, we seem to have lost a player. We'll probably be back soon, however.
I don't have time to play games with you. This is your last chance to run away. Get away! What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
Well, unfortunately I'm told that match was a little bit laggy, so hopefully this next one around will be a bit better. I didn't notice a great deal on my side, but networks are interesting sometimes, so you never know how it's really going to come out on both sides.
Let's see how strong you are. Don't make me laugh. All right. I will do my best.
I'll end this quickly.
cannot lose this fight.
I'm giving this all I got.
See how strong you are. I cannot lose you. Are you ready? Oh dear, what happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
Variation does make a great deal of difference in this game. If you end up finding yourself in a state where either you're a little bit lost or you're just trying to push really hard and hitting too many buttons, or you're not really paying attention to your flow exactly, it's very easy to end up in a pattern where you're effectively hitting the same thing over and over again. And this is a problem I notice in myself a lot, actually, if I'm not on top of things or I get distracted or overwhelmed at all. But in a game like this, where so much of it is based on countering, where holds are both a thing and such a big deal, even with the break blow now that you only have to get the timing right if you happen to have a meter, it can be quite a thing to get stuck in those patterns, and learning how to vary things, make sure that whenever your opponent expects you to attack, you're not, or whether when they don't expect you to attack, you are, is a really big deal. You can't just fall back on the same pressure strings and end up back in neutral or whatever in ways that I would say, I suppose, tend to happen a bit more often at the lower levels of some other games. If you end up spending your time
Last chance to run
finishing block strings, for instance, or always doing a particular thing in a particular spacing, it's going to get painful.
to take me out?
This is your last chance to run away.
end this quickly.
We've had a much quieter lounge tonight, much less guests. And we are finishing it out technically where we began. Why did they let her have the hat? Sure, why not? Anyway. We are closing up our stream after this. The lounge itself will stay open for a while longer. We can't exactly say how long, but definitely like 20, maybe 30 minutes if you want to join in. There may also be less people playing, some people shifting to spectate, and so on, but you may not see all of the same people in the lounge. You're still looking for 2MK, of course, and bear in mind that this is mostly the US East Coast, Northern Hemisphere, Atlantic Rim sort of lobby. I think I'm going to start saying Atlantic Rim now. Anyway.
I cannot lose this fight.
All right.
Feel free to join in,
I will do my
especially if you're a beginner. Because we are fairly good at judging how hard to push on someone based on what they're doing. And, as one of our players constantly points out, it's good to learn what you can and can't do. In other words, being good at stopping things kind of matters. And if you were, let's say, someone who didn't really want to be on stream, that's basically your option. We will be continuing to play, but without actually having anything. We are still working on DoA bots. We've had some timing issues with releases and a bunch of other things. You know how it is. The world is crazy right now by most people's standards. But we will be seeing what happens, and we will be announcing anything that does happen on our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC. Same place you can find the information on what we're streaming for the day, if we are streaming or won't be. Usually we won't let know until about 7, but we may manage to tell you earlier in the day depending. It's a matter of coordinating team members to actually get content. You can find our bots, because we do have some already released, at 2-mk.org. And while this game does not have one of the better setups for using bots specifically, namely that the inputs get lost more or less between anything you do and you have to dedicate to training with the bot with one character in one stage. Maybe one of these days this will be changed, but for now they are a little bit more limiting than our other bots in terms of when you can use them, but not particularly in terms of how. So we're still doing pretty well on that front. Check them out, particularly the easier to input ones, see what you get. With a little luck you will learn something.
You won't tell anyone.
But that brings us to the end of the stream. This has been Rillian along with Kansuki Dynasty. 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.